The old mansion stood on the edge of town, a looming silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its windows were dark eyes, watching, judging. For years it had stood empty, a monument to forgotten grandeur and whispered tales of tragedy. Locals gave it a wide berth, crossing the street when they passed, quickening their steps. The house, they said, was hungry. But rumors, however persistent, do little to deter a desperate soul. And I was desperate. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I was a scholar of the occult, a hunter of the unseen. I had spent years chasing phantoms, delving into the shadows where logic dared not tread. But my obsession, like a relentless tide, had eroded my life, leaving me adrift in a sea of debt and despair. When the letter arrived, bearing the crest of the Blackwood family, I saw it as a lifeline. The letter was a plea for help, a desperate whisper from the last surviving heir, a young woman named Seraphina Blackwood. She wrote of strange occurrences, of shadows moving in the corners of her eyes, of whispers that chilled the bone. She spoke of a darkness that had settled upon the house, a darkness that threatened to consume her. I, with my expertise in the arcane, was her only hope. The reward she offered was more than generous. It was salvation. So, on a day when the wind carried the scent of rain and the dying leaves danced like tormented souls, I arrived at Blackwood Manor. The iron gates, rusted and overgrown with thorny vines, creaked open as if in protest. The gravel driveway, choked with weeds, crunched beneath my car's tires. As I stepped out, the air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive silence. The house loomed before me, a Gothic monstrosity of grey stone and shadowed gables. Its once elegant facade was now marred by peeling paint and crumbling masonry. Twisted gargoyles leered from the roofline, their stone faces contorted in silent screams. A chill, sharper than the autumn air, settled upon me, seeping into my bones. I had a fleeting moment of doubt, a whisper of warning from my inner voice. But the desperation that had brought me here was a powerful force, pushing aside all reason. I squared my shoulders, adjusted the satchel containing my tools of the trade, my reader, my camera, my notebook, and a silver crucifix for good measure, and approached the heavy oak door. The knocker, a snarling wolf's head, was cold and unyielding beneath my hand. The sound of the knock echoed through the silence, a hollow boom that seemed to reverberate through the very structure of the house. I waited, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still, only silence. I tried the door handle. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, cavernous hall. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying the scent of dust and decay. The faintest hint of something else lingered beneath a metallic, almost coppery odor that made my stomach churn. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing through the emptiness. There was no reply. Hesitantly, I stepped inside. The door swung shut behind me with a heavy thud, the sound amplifying the sudden silence that engulfed me. I stood in the darkness, listening. The only sound was the beating of my own heart, loud and insistent in my ears. My eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, revealing the grand hall in all its faded glory. Cobwebs draped the ornate chandeliers like ghostly shrouds. A thick layer of dust covered the once polished floor, and the air hung heavy with the weight of neglect and forgotten memories. A grand staircase, its dark wood polished smooth by countless footsteps, swept upwards into the shadows. Portraits of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved. I had an unsettling feeling of being watched, observed by unseen eyes. "Miss Blackwood," I called out again, my voice hesitant. "Seraphina." Only silence answered me. The unsettling feeling grew stronger. I drew a deep breath, trying to quell the rising unease within me. This was what I did. This was my element. I was Eleanor Vance, and I did not scare easily. Or so I told myself. I began to explore the house, moving from room to room. Each chamber was a tableau of decay, a testament to the ravages of time and neglect. The library, with its towering bookshelves and leather-bound volumes, was thick with the scent of dust and mildew. The dining room, with its long, empty table and cobweb-draped chairs, seemed to echo with the ghosts of forgotten meals. The drawing room, where I assumed the family had once entertained guests, held the most unsettling atmosphere. The air here was heavier, colder. A chill settled upon me the moment I stepped inside, prickling my skin. A grand piano sat in one corner, its ivory keys yellowed with age. A single sheet of music lay on the stand, brittle and faded. I touched it, and it crumbled to dust beneath my fingertips. It was in the drawing room that I felt the first true manifestation of the unseen. A cold draft, sudden and sharp, swept through the room, stirring the dust motes into a swirling dance. The heavy velvet curtains billowed inward as if pulled by an invisible hand. The hair on my arms stood on end. I reached for my Emfrida, my heart pounding in my chest. The device crackled to life, its needle jumping erratically. There was something here, something unseen but undeniably present. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the veil of my bravado. I was alone in this house, alone with whatever it was that haunted these halls. With the Emfrida in one hand and my crucifix in the other, I continued my exploration. I climbed the grand staircase, each creaking step echoing through the oppressive silence. The upper floors were even more desolate than the lower levels. Dust lay thick upon everything, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. The bedrooms were cold and empty, their beds stripped bare, their wardrobes gaping open like hungry mouths. In one room, I found a child's nursery. A rocking horse stood in the corner, its paint chipped, its once bright colors faded to a ghostly pastel. A doll lay discarded on the floor, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. As I moved from room to room, the feeling of being watched intensified. The whispers, which I had initially dismissed as the wind playing tricks on my ears, grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very fabric of the house. They were unintelligible, a cacophony of murmurs and sighs, but their tone was unmistakable, malevolent, hungry. I found Seraphina Blackwood in the master suite, at the end of a long, shadowy corridor. The door was ajar, and I could hear her sobbing inside. Hesitantly, I pushed the door open. The room was large and opulent, but like the rest of the house, it was shrouded in an air of neglect. Heavy drapes blocked the sunlight, casting the room in perpetual twilight. The furniture was draped in dust sheets, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Seraphina sat on the edge of a large, canopied bed, her shoulders shaking with sobs. She was a young woman, no more than 20, with long, dark hair that cascaded down her back like a raven's wing. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed with tears. She wore a simple white nightgown that clung to her slender frame. "Miss Blackwood," I said softly. She looked up, startled. Her eyes, wide and dark, were filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I thought you wouldn't come." "Of course I came," I said, approaching her cautiously. "I received your letter. You said you needed help." She nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "The house, it's not safe. There's something here, something evil." I sat down beside her on the bed, keeping a wary eye on the shadows that seemed to deepen around us. "Tell me everything," I said. "Start from the beginning." Seraphina took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "It started subtly at first," she said. "Small things, a book falling from a shelf, a door slamming shut on its own, a feeling of being watched. I dismissed it as my imagination, the stress of being alone in this big house." She paused, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "But then it got worse. The whispers started. I'd hear them at night, just outside my door. Sometimes I'd feel a cold breath on my neck, even though I was alone in my room." She shivered, drawing her knees up to her chest. Then I started seeing things. Shadows moving in the corners of my eyes. Glimpses of figures in the mirrors. I knew I had to get help. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice low. She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know. They were just shadows, fleeting glimpses. But I felt something watching me, something malevolent. I reached into my satchel and pulled out my Emfrida. "Do you mind if I take some readings?" I asked. She shook her head. "Please, do whatever you need to do." I activated the device and began to sweep it around the room. The needle jumped erratically, confirming what I already suspected. There was a strong electromagnetic presence here, much stronger than I had encountered in any of the other rooms. "There's definitely something here," I said, my voice grim. "Something powerful." Seraphina's face paled. What is it?" I don't know yet, I said, but I intend to find out. I spent the next few hours exploring the house with Seraphina, using my EMF reader and other tools to map out the areas of strongest paranormal activity. The whispers followed us everywhere, a constant reminder of the unseen presence that lurked within these walls. The shadows seemed to deepen around us, and the feeling of being watched intensified with each passing moment. As evening fell, we retreated to the master suite, where I had set up a temporary command center. I spread my notes out on the bed, studying the readings and trying to make sense of the patterns. Seraphina sat beside me, watching me work, her eyes wide with apprehension. "What have you found?" she asked nervously. "There are several areas of strong activity," I said, pointing to the map I had drawn. "The drawing room, the library, and this room, but the strongest readings are coming from the attic." Seraphina shivered. "The attic? I've never been up there. It's always been locked." "We need to go up there," I said. "That's where the answers lie." Seraphina's eyes widened with fear. "But it's dangerous. We can't." "We have to," I interrupted her. "We need to face whatever is haunting this house. We need to understand it." I saw the fear in her eyes, but I also saw a flicker of determination. She was terrified, but she was also desperate for answers, desperate for an end to the torment that had plagued her for so long. "All right," she said finally. "Let's do it." We waited until nightfall, when the house was at its most silent. Armed with my EMF reader, my camera, and a flashlight, we made our way to the attic door. The door was old and heavy, its wood warped and cracked. The lock was rusty and seized. It took me several minutes to break it, the sound echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. The moment the door swung open, a blast of cold air hit us, carrying with it the overwhelming stench of decay and something else, something metallic and cloying, like the smell of old blood. I felt a wave of nausea, and Seraphina gagged beside me. The attic was a vast, cavernous space, its roof beams lost in the darkness overhead. Dust and cobwebs lay thick upon everything, undisturbed for decades. The only light came from our flashlight beams, which danced across the gloom, illuminating forgotten objects, trunks, boxes, pieces of furniture shrouded in dust sheets. We moved cautiously through the attic, our senses on high alert. The whispers seemed louder up here, closer, and the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. My EMF reader buzzed frantically, its needle swinging wildly. There was something here, something powerful and malevolent, and it was close. We came to a clearing in the center of the attic. In the middle of the clearing stood a large, wooden chest, its surface covered in ornate carvings. The chest seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, drawing our eyes to it. "What is that?" Seraphina whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my gaze fixed on the chest. "But I think we need to open it." Seraphina hesitated. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "I have a feeling this is the key to everything." We approached the chest cautiously. The carvings on its surface seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of our flashlights. I reached out and touched the cold, smooth wood. A jolt of energy shot through me, making me gasp. "It's locked," I said, examining the elaborate mechanism. "But I think I can pick it." I reached into my satchel and pulled out a set of lock picks. As I worked on the lock, the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They seemed to be coming from the chest itself, from whatever lay trapped inside. The lock clicked open. I took a deep breath and slowly lifted the heavy lid. The stench hit us first, a wave of decay so overpowering that it made me gag. Seraphina turned away, retching. I fought back the nausea and shone my flashlight into the chest. The chest was filled with bones, human bones, skulls, femurs, ribs, vertebrae, all jumbled together in a macabre heap. The bones were old, brittle, some of them cracked and broken, but it was what lay nestled among the bones that made my blood run cold. It was a book. A small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. The book was bound with a silver clasp, and on the clasp was engraved a single, staring eye. I reached into the chest, my hand trembling, and picked up the book. The moment my fingers touched the leather, the whispers reached a crescendo, a cacophony of voices screaming in my head. I stumbled back, dropping the book. It landed on the dusty floor with a thud. Seraphina looked up, her eyes wide with terror. What was that? I don't know, I said, my voice shaking. But I think we found what we were looking for. I picked up the book again, this time steeling myself against the assault on my senses. I opened the silver clasp and carefully turned the brittle pages. The book was written in an ancient language, one I had never seen before. The script was elegant and flowing, but the words seemed to writhe on the page, as if alive. As I deciphered the text, a chill settled upon me, a cold dread that seeped into my very soul. The book was a diary of darkness, a chronicle of the Blackwood family's descent into madness and depravity. The first entries were mundane, detailing the everyday life of the family. Births, deaths, marriages, business dealings. But as the years progressed, the entries grew darker, more twisted. The writer spoke of strange rituals, of sacrifices made to appease the unseen forces that lurked in the shadows. He spoke of a hunger that consumed him, a hunger that could only be satisfied by blood. As I read on, I realized with growing horror that the bones in the chest belonged to the Blackwood family's victims. Men, women, and children, all sacrificed to appease the dark entity that the family had worshipped. And the writer of the diary, the one who had orchestrated these horrors, was the very first Blackwood ancestor, the one whose portrait hung in the grand hall downstairs. I closed the book, my stomach churning. I looked at Seraphina, her face ashen with fear. "This house, it's built on blood," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "The Blackwoods, they made a pact with something evil, something that feeds on suffering and death." Seraphina's eyes filled with tears. Then we're doomed. There's no escape." "No," I said, shaking my head. "We can break the pact. We have to." The whispers seemed to intensify, mocking my words. The shadows pressed closer, their darkness palpable. "But how?" Seraphina whispered. "We need to destroy the source of the entity's power," I said. "The book. It's a conduit, a link between this world and whatever dark realm the entity comes from." "But what about the bones?" Seraphina asked. "The victims? We'll give them a proper burial," I said. "We'll lay their souls to rest." I picked up the book and held it out to Seraphina. "We have to do this together," I said. "You're a Blackwood. It's your legacy to break this curse." She hesitated for a moment, then took the book from me. Her hand trembled, but her eyes were filled with a newfound resolve. We left the attic, the whispers and shadows following us. We made our way down the stairs, each step heavy with the weight of the house's history. The air grew colder as we descended, and the darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides. We reached the drawing room, where the entity's presence was strongest. The room was filled with an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of our own breathing. I took a deep breath and opened the book. The pages rustled, the sound echoing through the silence. The whispers intensified, a chorus of voices rising in anger and fear. "We have to burn it," I said, my voice barely audible above the din. Seraphina nodded. She took the book from me and held it over the fireplace. Her hand trembled, but she didn't hesitate. She struck a match and touched the flame to the brittle pages. The book caught fire, the flames licking upward, consuming the ancient words and the secrets they held. The moment the flames touched the book, the room erupted in a cacophony of sound. The whispers became screams, echoing through the house, shaking the very walls. The shadows writhed and churned, their darkness taking on a life of its own. Seraphina and I stood side by side, our hands clasped tightly together as the entity raged around us. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. The portraits on the walls seemed to come alive, the eyes of the Blackwood ancestors burning with hatred and despair. The flames grew higher, consuming the book, consuming the entity's power. The screams grew louder, more desperate, then abruptly ceased. The shadows receded, their darkness shrinking back into the corners of the room. The air grew still, the silence deafening after the cacophony that had preceded it. The only sound was the crackling of the flames as they consumed the last of the book. Seraphina and I stood there for a long moment, our hearts pounding in our chests, the silence pressing in on us. The house was quiet. The whispers were gone. The shadows were still. The entity was gone. We had broken the pact. We left the house as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. The house looked different in the daylight, less menacing, almost peaceful. But the memories lingered, the shadows of the horrors that had transpired within its walls. We took the bones from the attic and gave them a proper burial in the Blackwood family cemetery, a small plot of land behind the house. As we laid the remains to rest, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling that the victims were finally at peace. Seraphina decided to sell the house. She couldn't bear to stay there, not after what she had learned. She said she planned to travel, to see the world, to find a place where the shadows of her family's past couldn't reach her. I watched her go, a young woman freed from the curse that had haunted her family for generations. I knew she would never forget the horrors she had witnessed, but I also knew that she was strong, that she would survive. I left Blackwood Manor that day, a wiser and perhaps a sadder woman. I had faced the darkness, and I had emerged victorious. But I had also glimpsed the depths of human depravity, the darkness that lurks within the human heart. And I knew that the shadows would always be there, waiting for me, beckoning me to delve once more into the unseen world. But for now, I needed rest. I needed to heal. I needed to forget. I drove away from Blackwood Manor, leaving the house behind me, silhouetted against the rising sun. I looked back once, a last glance at the place that had tested me, challenged me, and ultimately changed me. And then I drove on, into the light.